As many of you know, Human Rights First was honored to bestow its annual Human Rights Award on Chen Guangcheng, the blind, self-taught human rights lawyer from China. He wanted to be here with us for the summit, but his schedule did not permit. But he wanted me to share something with you. And so if you'll bear with me, I'm going to read something. It's okay if I keep talking from here? Okay. He asked me to read something. There's been a development in the case of his nephew, and he's very keen to make sure that everyone at this gathering knows about it. You know, when Chen fled to the American embassy in Beijing last spring, armed thugs broke into his brother's house and viciously beat Chen's brother and his wife. And Mr. Chen's nephew, Chen, you want to give me that so you can move this? I'm reading something, so I kind of need this podium. His nephew, Chen Kaggwa, was able to fend off the attackers with a kitchen knife, injuring them but not killing any of them. These were village officials, thugs. But then he was arrested for doing that, and he's been held without access to his family or the lawyers that his family retained for him. And last week, actually over the weekend, he was abruptly brought to trial. And this is the account of that trial as relayed to Chen Guangcheng and his wife, Ai Weiwei, by Mr. Chen's older brother, the father of the imprisoned nephew, Chen Guangwei. Here is the account. On November 30th at 10:38 in the morning, Chen Guangcheng's older brother suddenly got a call from his son's court-appointed lawyer, who said that his nephew's trial was starting that day at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Having not been at home the day before, the lawyer claimed that he didn't get the notice until that morning. The older brother then went as fast as he could to the courthouse, but by the time he got there, it was already 1:30 in the afternoon. So he told the other officially appointed lawyer that he wanted to observe the trial, but he was told that he was not allowed to because he was a witness in the case. Remember, the father was the one who was attacked. And he insisted, saying, as his father, I should be able to observe the trial of my son. The lawyer refused. This is the lawyer for the son, the officially appointed lawyer. The father then tried to get into the courthouse entry but was blocked by a crowd of policemen. They said he had to wait outside, and he had no choice in the face of the crowd of policemen but to do as they said. So he waited and waited, never getting any information from anyone. The police decided he should wait across the street from the courthouse since his wife was also across the street being held by another crowd of police. Mr. Chen's brother was probably worried for her safety, so he obeyed them and went across the street, only to be put in a police van with his wife. They were shut in the van and kept there all afternoon from 2 until 5 when the trial ended. The police kept saying that they were witnesses in the case. Victims is what we would call them. But throughout the case, no one ever let them into the court to speak. Then, around 5 p.m., they heard a police car siren and knew that the trial had concluded. Thinking that his son, Mr. Chen's nephew, would be exiting the courthouse, he wanted to look out of the police van window to see his son with his own eyes, as he hadn't seen them in half a year. He wasn't sure that he would be able to, but at the very least, he wanted to see which car he got into. But even this small wish wasn't fulfilled. Just as he tried to put his head out the window, the car he was in was surrounded by plainclothes policemen, preventing him from seeing anything out the window. And that was how it ended, along with the guilty verdict of deliberately causing injury and the sentence of 3 years and 3 months in prison. Now, that's the account that we got through Mr. Chen from his brother in China. In the next panel, we're going to ask what human rights activists are looking to the United States for. And here's the answer that Chen Guangcheng and his wife gave when we asked them that question. Quote, at this time, the U.S. election has concluded and China's 18th Party Congress has ended as well. I hope the U.S. government will continue to press China to follow through with the promise they made to me, as well as to the United States and the entire world, to thoroughly investigate the many years of wrongdoing we have suffered in Shandong according to the law and to guarantee my family's safety. At the China Congress, the issues of reform and fighting corruption were repeatedly raised. In particular, the newly elected chairman and premier have spoken at length on this. However, action is more important than words. That's Chen Guangcheng's message to us, and I wanted to make sure that we shared it with all of you. Now I would like to invite the panel to come join me on the stage. Okay, one more quick word from me, and I'll turn it over to Assistant Secretary Lorne Craner. It's really a privilege to have Lorne Craner here with us. He's going to moderate this panel on human rights activists in U.S. foreign policy. Lorne is the president of the International Republican Institute, and he was previously in the post of Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and was a terrific Assistant Secretary with whom we worked very, very closely. Upon his departure from that post, he received the Distinguished Service Award, the State Department's highest honor. He is one of our nation's leading voices on human rights, and we're very, very pleased to have him here to moderate this discussion of activists from around the world. Thank you very much, Lorne.
Thank you very much, Elisa. And let me say what an honor and a privilege it is to be here, not only with so many principled people in the audience, but also with these courageous men and women who are going to be speaking today. I do understand we have a message, is that correct, from Ai Weiwei, that we're going to run on the video before we begin as another activist. So if that is the case, let's go ahead.
Hello, my name is Ai Weiwei. I'm from Beijing. I'm an artist, and as an artist, my work always have to deal with freedom of expression. In China, we don't have freedom of expression. All the press are controlled by states, and there's not flow of information in the internet. Major internet sites like Facebook, Twitter, Google, and YouTube, and many others are being shut off or blocked in China. So there's not flow of information in here. All the information are given by the states, and discussion is forbidden. So my work somehow involved with those situations because my profession have to relate to truth, facts, and also has to communicate with others. I was so badly being treated as a so-called subversion of state power. I was beaten, my studio was destroyed, I was taken in detention, I was secretly being arrested, and also being put on a very heavy economic fine. And now my situation is I still cannot travel, cannot attend my own exhibitions, which is now in Hirshhorn Gallery in Washington, D.C., and many events around the world. My work are very restricted in China. I never had art shows here. My name cannot appear on the domestic internet site. If anybody type my name, that whole sentence will disappear, or even the person's internet site can be shut off. I have been very active in past 5-6 years, and first on the internet, I think to extend my support on human rights struggle or freedom of expression is so necessary in this society, because otherwise China would never become a modern society. Even with very extreme economic growth, China still maintains as a society with no sense of creativity, because young people are never being encouraged to be free or to have imagination or passion. Most of my activities is trying to get young people involved to take responsibility. And only by doing that, I think they can have a full life, and they can make their life meaningful. When we talk about freedom, freedom always have its own meaning in very different circumstances. So to insist on the freedom of expression and to insist on to search for the facts and the truth is something everybody can do, and that will make a big difference. I think any leaders of mankind or of any political condition should always understand to protect human rights, to protect the freedom of expression, to protect the law. It's always kind of value which can be shared by other people, which will benefit human being as a whole. And then if any place, anybody which has no freedom, which is under such a oppression, and that means we all, as a society, we all will be jeopardized by this kind of condition. And I think nobody can separate one area or one place from the other. We all know today, and China is a very important factor in the global economy and the politics. And not to insist on human rights under any kind of excuse would eventually end up as human tragedy. So I think any leader, when they have a chance to dealing with China, have to insist on human rights, rule of the law, and freedom of expression, and those things are values which would benefit whole world.
You just heard from Ai Weiwei, who, as you all know, is one of China's most prominent dissidents and has suffered because of it. We're very lucky today to be able to hear from others about the ground truth that exists in their country and what they hope to get in terms of support by the United States. Let me first begin by thanking Elisa for the invite, but also for the important work of Human Rights First. Elisa and HRF play an important role in our civil society here in the United States, and I think I can fairly call them the conscience of our country and the government. I well recall Elisa visiting me many times when I worked for Colin Powell as his Assistant Secretary on Democracy and Human Rights on issues ranging from China to Guantanamo. And I have no doubt she's also been in to see my successor, Mike Posner, who used to head Human Rights First. Given my experience ensuring democracy and human rights are part of foreign policy, I really look forward to moderating this panel on looking for leadership. What do human rights activists want from the United States? To help us answer that question today, we have an amazing panel of some of the most courageous people you'll ever meet. I won't read their bios because you have them already, but let me summarize briefly some biographical information. Rula, to my left, after studying in the United States, returned to her native land and became president of the Bahraini Nurses Association. She was arrested in 2011 after working at a Manama hospital receiving casualties from the demonstrations there. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but after 5 months of brutal imprisonment, was released on appeal. And if you want to know more, I highly recommend an October 2011 piece in the London Guardian regarding Rula that she tells me is quite accurate. Oleg Kozlovsky is a Russian civil disobedience activist and director of Russia's Vision for Tomorrow Foundation. For his activism, he's been arrested numerous times and was even drafted into the army for the duration of the 2008 presidential campaign. While in prison, he made Amnesty International's Prisoner of Conscience list, and he's a previous recipient of a Human Rights First Award. Julius Kaggwa, Executive Director of Uganda's Support Initiative for People with Atypical Sex Development. led Uganda's civil society campaign against the 2009 homosexuality bill in Uganda's parliament, and he continues that work literally even today as we speak. I had the opportunity to hear Julius on Monday on NPR's Kojo Namdi show, and I would recommend all of you listen to that. An advocate and expert on Indonesian law, Haris Azhar, educated at Essex University, has for almost 15 years been working for Indonesia's Commission for the Disappeared and Victims of Violence. And on my right, Cristina Hardaga works to defend human rights in the Mexican state of Guerrero. She previously worked at the Mexican Commission for the Defense and Promotion of Human Rights, and also, as we were discussing, in Mexico's legislature with the PRD, the Party of the Democratic Revolution. I've asked each to give a short statement on a kind of general approach on this issue that we're going to be discussing today, because I know I have a lot of questions that we haven't yet talked about, and I know you're going to have many questions for our courageous activists. So let me ask Rula if she will begin.
Thank you very much. It was 15 years, not 5, so you better be careful with that. Okay. Good evening, everybody. I'm here because the medics are still in jail. They had the medics, the human rights defenders, the political prisoners. They're all having an unfair and injustice trials. The U.S. officials have attended the trials, and still we are only concerned about it. Plus, I believe that the situation in Bahrain started as a political issue and then changed into human rights defense, and now it's really a humanitarian issue. And as we speak, we have one guy, his name is Abdullah Taqi. He is a U.S. citizen. He is in jail without any trial. He is in custody and no trials for the past month. And we have several issues, and there's a lot of people who are still in jail who are prisoners of conscience, and I'm here to help one way or another to release these people. Thank you.
Oleg?
In Russia, I think, as some of you know, the situation has changed dramatically. Exactly a year ago, today is the first anniversary of the first major protest that we saw in many, many years in Moscow after the fraudulent parliamentary elections. And after that, we saw a major backlash from the government, from the regime, against the civil society. And it is continuing today. And this is the situation when I think the United States should reaffirm its commitment to democracy and human rights in Russia. The policy that the U.S. has introduced in Russia is called Reset, and while they deserve credit, especially I would say that Ambassador Michael McFaul deserves credit for engaging with the civil society and working with them and with us throughout these years. We haven't seen a lot of, or I would say any progress on the democracy and human rights side of US-Russian dialogue. And I think with the changing situation in my country, the approach has also has to change.
I think both Rula and Oleg are pointing to examples of inconsistency in U.S. foreign policy on these issues, which, as we were discussing before, is not the first time that has ever happened, or the first administration in which that has ever happened, but we'll come back to that. Julius, you've had a somewhat better experience with U.S. policy.
Well, maybe. We have disparities in there, but as many of you may know, there was, in 2009, there was a bill that was tabled before the Uganda Parliament that sought to criminalize same-sex love and variant gender identities. And some of the punishments, it actually sought to tighten punishment for these alleged crimes. And some of the punishments that it proposed included life imprisonment for LGBTI individuals, imprisonment for other people that are related to LGBT people, like parents, educators, doctors, counselors, anybody in authority of an LGBTI individual who failed to report the criminal within a time frame of 24 hours. And more aggressively was the punishment, the death penalty for LGBTI individuals who are also HIV positive, who would be deemed as serial offenders. Serial in the sense that they kept committing the crime of homosexuality, you know. So it might sound funny, but it is a serious issue on the ground. This bill has become a plague for us that won't go away. A lot of advocacy was done by partners around the world, the U.S. government, organizations in the here in the United States have been aggressively advocating and against the bill and standing with us in this journey. Having said that, of course, I must note that a lot of the support for the bill is also coming from here. So that is the kind of situation that we have. It's coming from extremist faith leaders in this country as well. So we have a problem with that. And maybe it's why I'm here to really ask for some kind of consolidated message around the issue of human rights for everybody. But as we speak now, the bill is back in Parliament. We thought we had gained some form of success when the 8th Parliament closed without passing the bill. And now the bill is back in Parliament, and as we speak, the Speaker of Parliament, having been, having been tickled by the Canadian minister at one of the meetings that she was at, is now aggressively pushing to have the bill retabled and actually passed. In her own words, she has promised the Ugandan parliamentarians to pass this bill as a Christmas gift this year. So we are thinking anything can happen. And if that happens, I cannot be able to speak, not just me, but a number of other colleagues that have been working on this will not be able to speak in my own country or anywhere. But not just that, anybody in Uganda will not be able to engage on anything around same-sex love. Even if you found someone sick, you're not going to be able to treat them or listen to them, or it's that kind of situation that is happening. And so that is what I'm here to share with you and to see how the United States can continue pushing, just like you have been doing, to see that this does not happen.
And I understand the bill will be up for consideration perhaps within even the next few days.
Yes, it was on the order paper of Parliament yesterday, but it didn't get read because there are several other bills there, including the bill around oil issues. It was supposed to be on the order paper today, but again, it wasn't read. So I still have time to convince all of you and the U.S. government to insist that we get it postponed until we get rid of it.
Harris?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's been 14 years that Indonesia started the democratization process. In the early years, I think the U.S. government played quite a substantial role on how to support not only the government itself, the new government, but also the CSOs and some other groups within the society. But unfortunately, from our side, because my organization worked a lot on how to deal with the past abuses, so in that early years, it was quite important for us on how to bring the perpetrators, the big fishes, especially into the accountability process. But 9/11, it's quite something for us on how to shift the U.S. government policy, which is not to delete the human rights agenda, but the security agenda has brought a lot of a bigger one compared to the other. So I think at that moment, the police institution, the military institution, still in the fragile, going nowhere, back to the past or looking for something new. But this global agenda insist them on how to take a big role
Right.
in this so-called war on terror. So these kind of things. But I would like to, beside this kind of big questions or negative point, but I think Indonesia, I don't know whether this is the US government policy give inputs to Indonesian situation, but also vice versa. The Lehi Law, I think, according to my understanding, Lehi Law was initiated looking at the experience of Indonesia, thinking on how to limit those perpetrators not to come to America. But this is also these days become a question as well, because those perpetrators not coming to America, so they keep staying in Indonesia. So we have to deal with it. I will be glad if they can come to America, then there will be no perpetrators in Indonesia. That's all.
A novel idea. We'll see if we can pursue that. Cristina?
Thank you. Buenas tardes. I work now in the Tlachinollan Human Rights Center. It's a grassroots organization located in Guerrero, in the south of Mexico. I appreciate the opportunity to be in here with you. And also I want to thank Human Rights First for the invitation and for the space. For the human rights movement in Mexico, it's very important, and for us in Guerrero to have this space to talk about what is happening in my country. I know we have 3 minutes. I will try to stay in that margin of time. I want to apologize because I'm going to read very briefly part of the context of what is happening in my country. I want to read it because now I will be sure that I'm telling everything, and maybe I will convince you of what's happening, and so when I get back to Mexico I will still have my job. Well, for the humans, what does Mexican human rights activists want from the United States? This is not an easy question. As you know, Mexico and the US share the biggest border in the world, so there are many different human rights issues on the bilateral agenda between our country. Nevertheless, in these initial remarks, I will focus on the security agenda and its impact on human rights. I will talk first about the Mérida Initiative, which is the framework agreement of the bilateral cooperation in this matter. Then I will try to briefly describe the consequences of human rights of the security measures supported by the US in the last 6 years during President Felipe Calderón administration, which just ended. I will point out some of the concerns of the human rights community as we face a new presidential period, and I will try to bring some answers to the questions that bring us today. In December 2006, the Mexican President Felipe Calderón decided to begin a frontal battle against the drug trafficking organizations with the deployment of armed forces as a central piece of his strategy. It is important to say that this decision was not a central issue during his campaign, and that it was taken after highly debated elections. As a result of the decision, President Felipe Calderón and former US President George W. Bush began discussion in March 2007 for what will come to be known as the Mérida Initiative, an aid package to support the Mexican efforts in the war against drug cartels. In the following months, officials of both administrations met to draw up the basic structure of the proposed package, which centered largely in providing material and technical support to Mexico's security forces in their war against drug. This was a dialogue between counterparts without any consultation with the civil society or experts. At the beginning, the Mérida Initiative focused on law enforcement, strengthening the military and the police. In providing this security assistance to Mexico, the US Congress recognized the Mexican government need to make progress in the respect for human rights within the context of its contra-narcotics and public security operations. Therefore, Congress specified that 15% of funds within the Mérida Initiative could not be released until the US Department of State reported that the Mexican government was meeting critical human rights requirements. During the Obama administration, while a significant part of the assistance was still directed at combating organized crime, there was a greater focus on institutionalizing, promoting the rule of law, and support for human rights organizations and human rights defenders. For instance, a condition was placed stating that Mexico had to make accountable any human rights violations committed by the military, and that these human rights violations be trialed in civil jurisdiction. So far, this condition has been loosely enforced, but we are making important steps to get there. The United States has appropriated $1.9 billion in the Merida Initiative framework. This aid package complements other forms of U.S. security aid, including millions of dollars in annual military aid from the Department of Defense. It is estimated that the Department of Defense provides Mexico with over $260 million in assistance from fiscal year 2010 to 2012. But this assistance is difficult to track, and it is not subject to the same human rights conditions as the Merida Initiative. As I said, the Merida Initiative changed a little bit over the years, but Calderon's strategy didn't change at all, and neither did the U.S. support to it. What are the consequences of this security policy? After 6 years, it is clear that the effort to combat organized crime to the military as the centerpiece and with the support from the U.S. failed to contain the expansion of organized crime in Mexico, but contributed to a sharp escalation of violence on human rights violations across my country. When President Felipe Calderón declared war on organized crime in Mexico, around the world and here in the US, the decision was seen as a brave posture. But many of us in Mexico and many here in the United States were skeptical. We knew that Mexican justice and security system are endemically flawed, and the organized crime wasn't an enemy clearly identified, but rather an undefined group colluded with government authorities that overlapped. We knew also that Mexican security forces, and especially the army, had a catastrophic record of unpunished human rights abuses, especially against the civilian population, a legacy that never changed and continues today. After almost 6 years, it is clear that President Calderón's effort to combat organized crime with the military as the centerpiece and with support from the US is not the solution to the crisis of violence, but rather is contributed to the violence itself. While it is true that the drug cartels are committing violent crimes, it is false that in Mexico there is a war between cartel versus cartel, cartel versus state. In states like Guerrero, where I live, the line between the government and the criminals is hard to find. The infiltration of organized crime into Mexican institutions is entrenched and increasing. None of us could imagine the extent of human rights impact that this policy will have. Almost 6 years later, more than 60,000 people have died because this so-called war, in a context of disparate and generalized human rights violations, such as torture, extrajudicial executions, forced disappearances, and fabrication of false criminal charges against innocent people, all which remain unpunished. At the same time, citizens who stand up and fight for justice are targeted by both organized crime and corrupt officials. The violence they face as human rights defenders, journalists, has increased at alarming rates, with women facing the brunt of this violence as they become human rights defenders seeking justice for disappeared or murdered loved ones. Meanwhile, in spite of the dramatic increase in violence, and because the US-Mexico security policy fails to address the root issues of the violence, the drug cartels aren't losing their power, even though some of their well-known leaders have been detained or killed. Clearly, it's time to change the agenda, to shift them, to make a more comprehensive and integral strategy. To conclude, let me point out some of the main concerns of the human rights community in this context and our recommendation. 2012 was a presidential election year for Mexico and from the United States. 5 days ago, our new president, Enrique Peña Nieto, took office as a president. They are aware of the bad image of Mexico regarding security and violence, and he has stated that he will try to shift the agenda to economic issues. However, without denying that economic issues are fundamental, we fear that this change will remove human rights from the agenda and will certainly not address immediately the issues of the generalized violence which still reigns and exacerbates in different parts of the country. This will be tragic. The human rights impacts of the war in drugs are not over. It will be necessary that the US monitor the failure of the rule of law in Mexico. Specifically, we need the State Department to remain aware and concerned about the full implementation of justice. We have learned over the years that keeping the human rights condition in U.S. assistance through the Merit Initiative ensures that human rights will be part of the binational agenda. This is within the domain of the Congress. Let me say this clearly. In countries like Mexico, human rights conditions on the security are a package useful, and in this point needed. Thank you. I'm sorry for the time I took.
That was great. Thank you, Cristina. We appreciate it. Let me begin by kind of mentioning or explicating on something I said before, that this issue of inconsistency in human rights policy is nothing new. It's something that every administration deals with, and I've been in twice under James Baker and Colin Powell, and I watched them wrestling with these issues. So it's something that I think that kind of tension will always be there, but I think what would be valuable today is to get the perspective, and first I want to ask Horace and then Cristina, of what that inconsistency looks like when you're on the ground in a foreign country trying to help solve these issues, and you're counting on support from the United States, and what's the distance you often see between what we're doing and what we say we stand for? Horace?
I give you a very concrete example. I think 2 years ago, Hillary Clinton made a statement that media freedom in Indonesia has been running very well, more or less like that. But I think looking at the situation itself, the numbers of violence toward the journalists, it's quite increased. What she mean by the media freedom, it was how the media was is very powerful in order to discover everything, the corruptions, violence, everything. But the problem in Indonesia is not only that freedom exists. In journalist situation these days, I think they have a freedom to discover everything, to put in the news, but they don't have any protections after they publish the writings or the news itself. So they can be easily targeted. That is one. Second, I think what is important, looking at some cases, one of my colleague, the first coordinator of my organization, he was killed 2004. It was only 3 years, or it was in the middle of the heat moment of fight against terrorism. The group who killed our colleague is the intelligence agent, which was supported strongly by this agenda of war on terror. So the perpetrator exactly knew that he was, or they were, in the strong positions because they have a big agenda which is recognized by the world. So in order to kick out this guy, the human rights defender, it wasn't that big issue for them. So by that time, I think a lot of international attention came to this situation, looking at this case. But suddenly, after like 5 or 4 years, the support to this case decreased quite significant, including from the U.S. government or from the U.S. embassy. So if we met people from the embassies, I think they're quite aware how is the case, is there any progress, and so on and so forth. But I think we can see these days they are still doing nothing much in order to give pressure to the Indonesian government. What kind of pressure that I mean here? Back to the foreign policy by the U.S. government. Hillary Clinton came to Indonesia a few months ago, signed an agreement, a bilateral agreement between the U.S. government and the Indonesian government. My question is there any awareness in that agreement looking at the situation, the impunity of not only this murder of one human rights defender, but to the religious persecution, land grabbings, the failure to deal with the past abuses? We have a long list, not only those violence or human rights violation which came from the past, but also happened in this democratization process. So, come back to the very ideal value of the American value. Once you said that freedom is important, but you engage with the government that keep dilating, losing with the value itself that you admitted in your land, on your land, in your country, how does it feel? What kind of image that you would like to develop or would you like to get from the Indonesian society these days? So at the end, I have to be frank. For me, the human rights defender from the human rights community, it is quite clear to see the American position, the US position. But for people at large in my country, at the end they said that this is the American hypocrisy. Once you talk about human rights, but on the other side, you talk about weapons, for instance. This is the analogy.
So if you're going to say something, at least follow up on it. If you're going to have it in a speech, a line in a speech about journalists or whatever, you have to follow up.
Yeah, I think we, in many situations, in many cases, I have to admit it as well, our communication with the US Embassy is excellent. We are texting one to another and so on and so forth. But I think in terms of the communication, it's quite clear. But the point is, maybe it is important, this is sort of like an agenda recommendation as well. It is important to announce, the US government announce, this is our human rights agenda for Indonesia, which we can use, which we can refer to in order to evaluate. That is one. Second, I think we need to develop more closer and clear engagement between the US government through the US Embassy with several stakeholders in the country, the CSO, the journalists, and the government. So what kind of communication in order to measure a case or an issue, for instance? These kind of things. And also I would like to suggest as well, maybe Human Rights First need to take a lead on this as well, on how to develop the human rights defender guidelines. Like EU, they have this kind of guidelines, the human rights defender guidelines. But I think if US government also can develop this kind of guidelines on how the diplomats should work with the human rights defender on the ground, that will be quite substantial as well on how to develop more sophisticated relationship in these foreign policy matters.
You're right, we do not have that, and that would be valuable.
That's why I suggest you.
Yeah. Good, great. Cristina?
Yeah, I think it's complicated. We start changing our behavior in front of the US Embassy. I remember when I just started in the human rights activism, they always say, don't go to the US Embassy because the information you give them is for the CIA. And in the last years, we have been changing that concept because we start to see that the people who were in the embassy and the times we came to DC particularly to talk with the Congress and to the US Department, we saw that the people really care about what is happening. So it was like, no, it's not they only work for the CIA, it's that maybe they really care about what is happening and they want to make some changes or help us to make some measures or give us tools to how we can work in our country. But the problem is that now we have a lot of expectations about the people who are giving this information. So you know and you read statements and declarations about the importance of human rights, and in particular they point some issues that we have bring them. But in the time when they sit with the Mexican government, it's like we didn't say anything. So it's get really frustrating and gives you, it's not that it doesn't give you hope, but it's getting frustrating because you start to see that the human rights agenda is not an important thing for the bilateral relation. And in some countries, and particularly in Mexico, what United States says is important. And so you have to say it loud and open, because we are very expert to do everything in the back and hearing something and do nothing about that. So I think that we are in some point where we have to start, or we want to see that changes in the concrete actions, because you are giving money to making more strategies for the human rights organizations. And I know, because we have a lot of cases where now we have confidence to go into the US Embassy to present human rights defenders who are presenting cases of aggressions, and they have to leave the country. And the US Embassy is open to help us to work with that. But the structural issues, the ones who involve legislation reforms, political, investigation, concrete things, that's when we don't see the changes. That's when we don't see the Secretary of State and even the President, because in the other countries you see President Obama saying about Colombia and other countries, but in Mexico you don't have that. So it's, I think that's one of the situations where we are now to. Yes.
So not just quiet diplomacy, but always being somewhat public.
Yes.
In what we're saying.
Yes.
All of the countries up here have strategic interest, or are of strategic interest to the United States. But I do want to switch for my next set of questions, and we'll be coming to the audience in a minute, but to two countries where I think that's been very, very prominent, and that is Bahrain and Russia. And when you talk to policymakers, and you all know this, about Bahrain, inevitably Iran comes up, and the rightful, I think, concern with where Iran is heading. But I always worry when our policy towards one country becomes a function of a policy towards another. And I wanted to ask Rula to talk a little bit about that.
That's where the double standard starts again. When we talk about, we're going to talk about several issues here, if you don't mind me saying that. When we talk about Iran, when we talk about the revolution or the Arab Spring, the U.S. have dealt with Libya and with Egypt and with Yemen, similar, but not Bahrain. Bahrain is different because we are related to Iran. You know, years and years when I was studying here in the States, they asked me, where are you from? And I say, I'm from Bahrain, from the Arabian Gulf. And the answer always comes back, no, you are from the Persian Gulf. And I say, no, I'm from the Arabian Gulf. We call it Arabian Gulf. We don't speak Persian. We are Arabs. What is our relationship with Iran? Shish kebab, Persian carpets. And maybe, you know, as according to the CIA records, there are 70% Shia in Bahrain. That's very true. And just like the Christianity and the Catholics belong to the Vatican and Rome as the main hub for whatever orders have to be done, it's similar. There are few that follow people in, they have the religious schools, they are in Iran and in Iraq. Out of these 70% of people, some follow or few follow people in Iran, and few follow people in Iraq, and the other follow people in Lebanon. And the big question comes, where did this phobia come from? And I think the phobia came from because we want Bahrain to stay status quo the way it is right now. We have the 5th Fleet there. And Saudi Arabia, and I'm not a politician, by the way, okay? And Saudi Arabia pays money into the idea that Iran is going to attack, and you need to save us, and you need to help us, blah, blah, blah. And then, even with the medics, and the story, this is the story of, I think, all the lawyers in here, they should adopt the case of the medics in Bahrain and teach about the oath that they have taken, the principles of ethics, and all what done to the medics. One of the things they have accused us, that we are espionage with Iran, and that we have guns in the hospital. And my question to them, why didn't we use it? I don't know. I mean, and they brought it in court, and all of us goes, oh, guns? And we haven't seen guns. And of course, they were handling it with their hands, and it was a big chaos. I mean, funny, they asked some of the doctors, they've asked them, how many guns do you have? One of them said 2. And they, torture. And the other one, 3. And the other one, 4. And finally, one of them told them, Dr. Ali Al-Ikri, who was in jail for 5 years, you know what they've asked him? They said, how many guns do you have? He said 20. They asked him, where is it at? They told him, oh, it's in the medical school, at the corner, in the counter, under. So they ran into there to get the guns. They couldn't find them. They came back and tortured him more because they told him, you lied. It's like, we don't have any guns. We have nothing to do with Iran. Bahrain is a very independent country. I believe the phobia comes from the top politics. I believe it's because they wanted status quo. What will happen if the US tell Bahrain, since you have an unfair, it's not a human rights defense, it's humanitarian issues at the present time in Bahrain. What will happen if they tell them flat, they say, listen, if you don't change your strategies and if you don't do something about what's going on in Bahrain, then we need to move the Fifth Fleet. Question. Why can't they, when the medics, 23 medics now, the misdemeanors, they have the sentenced to 3 months in prison plus paying money. Why can't they tell them, instead of saying, we're deeply concerned about the medics, why can't you say, these are the medics, Ali Al-Ikri, Ghassan Daif, Ibrahim Al-Dimistani, Saeed Al-Samahij, they are all in jail and they need to be released because they didn't do anything, they went by their oath. This morning they were talking about immigration, and they were talking how lovely the US is doing, the immigration, we give them citizenship and blah, blah. Think about it, America is a melting pot, and you all come from different ancestors. Can you imagine tomorrow President Obama comes out and he says, blah, blah, Arriego, all this different last names, that we're going to pull your citizenship, just exactly what they did in Bahrain for 71 people who their ancestors are Persian. How would you guys feel about this? And this is exactly what happened in Bahrain. They need to say, listen, this is a no-no. Maybe the solution will be from outside. Why can't the Obama administration take the leadership with the principles of human rights, that they will take it, let's have a solution from outside for Bahrain, let's focus, and it has to be implemented and supervised. This is what needs to be done in Bahrain. Bahrain is in chaos. It is very sad. Yesterday, a little kid who's 16 years old, he tried to defend himself from the police because they were at very close range. He was hit with a shotgun, bird pellets, lost completely his face and his arm. He's in critical care. He's in ICU. And before we came in, I was checking to see how many hours still. He's still in surgery since last night, 12:30. This is how bad it is. Why are they having this massive abuse of using, let's say, poison gas? We know the tear gas, there is different kind. We have the white one, we have the yellow one, we have the one that causes all the kind of seizures. What about the militarization of our hospitals? People cannot be treated in the hospitals anymore. So I completely refuse to be associated with Iran. And like I told you, it's only shish kebab and Persian carpet. Thank you.
Very moving answer, thank you. Oleg, you're from a country that occasioned some of the first soul searching here in the United States about human rights. I'm old enough to remember the days of Gerald Ford and Richard Nixon and Solzhenitsyn and the bills in Congress to limit our relationship based on immigration. And I will be honest with you, I think in the first term of the Bush 43 administration, we were also a little too kind to Russia. And now I think that's happening again. What would you say about that?
Well, I agree with you, and when we talk about inconsistency, I think there are two types of it. One is between countries, something that Rula has referred to, and we can see it even if we look at the region, at the nearest neighbors of Russia. In Ukraine, Yanukovych put one person, the former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko, in jail for political reasons. She's certainly a political prisoner, and he now is almost unofficially a persona non grata in the West. In Russia, we have dozens of political prisoners, and still it doesn't prevent Putin from meeting with all the world leaders that he wants to meet with. In Belarus, Garry Kasparov yesterday mentioned it. Belarus dictator Alexander Lukashenko has almost an official title of the last dictator of Europe. And 2 years ago, I happened to be there in Minsk after the presidential elections when several dozen people attempted, in a huge rally, attempted to storm a government building, and it was used as a pretext to jail dozens of human rights and democracy activists and politicians, and sanctions were imposed and hardened against Belarus. In Russia, we had almost a similar case this May, the day before Putin's inauguration, a huge protest, very minor, even by American or European standards, very minor clashes between some protesters and some policemen. It was used as a pretext to jail 18 people. The first one of them has already received 4.5 years term, and the others are expected to get even more. And almost no reaction, and very violent opposition on the part of US administration against imposition of sanctions, namely the Magnitsky bill. Actually, this is a very effective and very efficient legislation that's being discussed, and hopefully that will pass the Senate just as we speak now. And it was struggling against the position of the administration for several years already. And now it's still the question how it will be implemented, because it gives a lot of flexibility to the White House and the State Department. So this is one example of inconsistency. The other one is when you see difference between words and actions. And here again, if we remember the reset policy, one of its cornerstones is that the United States works with the civil society in Russia and promotes human rights, democracy, development of the civil society. But when the Russian government expelled USAID this September from the country, something, I don't know if there had been any precedence of that in the past, there was almost no response, at least initially, from the government, from the US side. It was perhaps connected with some domestic political issues, because it was during the presidential campaign, but we can only hope now that some lessons will be learned and something will change in regards of support for the Russian civil society, because the first comments that we heard were like, okay, if they don't want, if the Russians don't want us, there are other countries to work in. And the fact is, Russians do want Americans to help, but not the Russian government. And there has to be very clear understanding that in countries like mine, or like Bahrain or other countries, you have very clear distinction between the society and the government, and you shouldn't give up helping the civil society just because the government doesn't like it.
Exactly. I'm getting a signal to go to audience Q&A. I want to ask Julius real quick if there was one more thing the U.S. could do to help beyond what we've been doing to help the situation in Uganda.
I think really continuing to help, yes, but putting your money where your mouth is would be really good. I mean, at the beginning of just recently, I was one of about 7 people from the coalition on the Ugandan Coalition on Human Rights and Constitutional Law that received an award from the State Department here, which is considered to be really the highest award for human rights defense. And shortly after that, and what we're trying to do as a coalition is to mainstream LGBT rights and not make them special rights. This is the message that the United States has been pushing, that these are not special rights.
They're universal.
They are human rights, just like other human rights. But constantly you find that at some point they're still being treated as special rights. Because after that award, the coalition then needed to mainstream this by bringing or enlarging or enhancing the base of the membership of the coalition, which includes mainstream human rights organizations in the country. And the greater the critical mass we have, the greater our leverage on trying to make sure that LGBTI people are safe. And just because we've had one or couple of deaths, two people die that are known all over the world, it does not mean that violence and hate crimes are not happening on the ground. It's just that the social, political, and economic cost is so high for these people to actually come up to say this is happening and this is happening. But when the coalition approached the US government to fund that activity, to try and mainstream these human rights, the proposal was denied. And the reason was, so many people are on board. The Swedes are on board, the Norwegians are on board, the Dutch are on board. But that should not be the issue. The most vocal people have been the Americans on this issue. And the American, including the President, the Secretary of State, there's been a lot of vocal support. Human Rights First organized a meeting, a physical meeting with President Obama during the last Human Rights Summit. And he has engaged ever since that, he has engaged very, very vigorously on this issue. The Secretary of State has been to Uganda, several high-profile Americans have been there. But when it comes down to it,
Put our money where our mouth is.
Then they will put money in the HIV issues and the evangelical issues and all of these prayer breakfasts and all of those things, which is great. But if that award and the visibility and the message that is being sent could be solidified to ensure that we get other human rights organizations to understand the message that you are sending, that we are also sending, it would, I think that would help.
Thank you all.
Otherwise, we are appreciative of the other.
Good start. Yeah. Okay, I know we want to go to Q&A from the audience. I think we have microphones, so if you can raise your hands. And just if you have an affiliation that you want to mention, please feel free. Yeah, somebody over here. And direct your question if you wish.
My question is for the whole panel. My name is Jessie Tannenbaum. I work with the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative. We're an NGO that's present in all of your countries. And I wondered if you could each give me 1 or 2 things that you'd like to see American NGOs working in your countries do.
Oleg, you want to start? And we'll just go this way.
Well, I think it really depends on the country. I think in Russia, what we would expect from American NGOs, one thing is to, and maybe this one is universal, is to keep pressure on your administration, on your Congress, and keep reminding the people, the society in general, of the challenges and problems that exist, and how they are connected with everyday problems of America, because I think all of this is interconnected, and it's just a question of how to explain these relations, these links. And another thing is we need expertise. We need people who know how to make things. We have, for instance, in our situation, we had a huge influx of new activists, of people who want to do something over the last year, who try to work under these conditions despite all the odds, but they often don't know how to make things. They are motivated, they are smart, but they have no experience, and I think that a lot of American organizations could share their experience with their Russian counterparts.
Christina?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is that we need to work as a coalition. I think it will be irresponsible to say we need this only thing that you can work, because it is important that the NGOs of the United States who are going to, in particular in Mexico, to work, first you have to understand how is the things on the ground. So maybe sometimes it's more helpful that you give us a bigger space to tell the things that already NGOs are doing, the things that they are already documenting, and sometimes maybe to increase the volume of the things we are already saying in our country. Thank you.
I think every organization have their mission and vision, and if one of your missions and visions are principles of human rights, then I think for us, at least for Bahrain, I would love to see different companies having a solidarity with the Bahraini people, having a walk with the Bahraini people. Name our prisoners, whether they are human rights defenders such as Nabil Rajab, or the medics who you know for a fact they worked very hard during the crisis. We did not sleep for 4 days, and then we were tortured and so on. Have a day in the name of Ali Al-Ikri, in the name of the medics, but name them. Just don't say these are for the medics. Have a big stand from the medical association, just like they did in Ireland. Whatever activities you do in solidarity for the Bahraini people, people in Bahrain hears it, and that's by itself, it's a great support, and it irritates the hell of the government. Thank you.
Yes. I think besides statements, like continued statements that human rights organizations keep issuing out, it would be really, really helpful for you to get in touch with faith leaders in this country, because for us they are a major source of problems. For them to really understand how human rights play into the faith framework, and how their extreme faith messages literally translate into human rights violations on the ground in our countries. You know, it's important for them to understand that faith is faith everywhere, but cultures differ, and the kind of messages that they send out have different effects in different cultures, and people are actually suffering. If that can be done, besides just writing petitions, which are great, if you can get them in one space to get them to understand what their evangelism is actually doing to us, and how that plays into the whole framework of human rights, that would be really helpful.
Thank you. I have a joke with a few colleagues in the office. We always said that the American money only for American organization. Most of the money from USAID, 100% goes to the American organization. One of it is Abaroli as well, Indonesia. So when Abaroli got the money from USAID, they present in Indonesia. That is one. Second, the way that they work is really, they know all the activists on the ground, but simply I can say that they are not grabs in the issue itself. So sometimes it takes a lot of energy for us just to give them a story what happening in the country, which is, it's supposed to be the story of 10 years ago, but we have to give, like a description and suggestion what to do. Sometimes it's like that, and mostly they are quite exclusive with the particular issues and looking for professionalism. This is the way on how to do with the parliament and so on and so forth. And they don't want to touch in the broader sense on how to keep work with the society, with the movement itself in the country. And the third one, this is a little bit painful for me. I have so many experiences. The USID, they have like the sister organization. And they would like to make sure that the money goes through this kind of sister organization. People who are working in that sister organization, mostly I can say they are not dealing a lot. They are not experiences with the issue itself. So they just looking for possibilities on paper, but they miss about the social calculations and the political calculations in order to achieve a certain movement into that issue itself.
Thank you. More questions? See somebody over here in the corner?
Thank you. Ryan Kaminsky with the United Nations Association. Thank you all for sharing your experiences. It's been very inspiring. This is a question for Mr. Kaggwa. I think there's been a lot of reports about the bill in Uganda, whether the death penalty provision has been deleted or re-added and then deleted again. And then there's been another update that if advocates so much as criticize the bill, they could be put in jail or worse. So just wondering if you could provide an update on the bill, like the bill itself, whether the death penalty provision is still included. It's bad either way, but this is, I think, important. And secondly, the UN Human Rights Council is expected to look at the issue of LGBT rights again in coming sessions in 2013. Do you think there's any certain provision within the powers of the Human Rights Council, what it's allowed to do, any particular area or action it can take that would be most important for the LGBTI community in ensuring their human rights?
Julie?
The bill is still as it was. The updated copy that we got, at least for the that was supposed to be tabled yesterday in Parliament, is exactly the same copy that we had in 2009. The death penalty is still there. The latest we had was that the Legal and Parliamentary Affairs Committee had a report to present along with the bill. And it is in that report that we have been told changes have been made. But that report was not presented. So we are not sure that there's actually any report or there are changes, but the bill has not changed. It came back to Parliament the same way that it was. So that's where we are at with the bill. And personally, and I think for my colleagues, as we have been thinking back and forth around this and saying maybe if they remove the death penalty, maybe if they remove this and the other. But when you look at that bill, really, there isn't a provision that we can say this can stay and this can go. Because the one provision that would probably be kind of mild would be the promotion. I would say promotion of homosexuality can probably stay. But when you look at that provision, it takes you back to almost the death penalty, because the broad sense in which promotion is defined in that provision literally means anybody can be witch hunted. I can send you a message from somewhere and they will track it because the communication and interception bill was passed. It's law. They can intercept, they can track any kind of communication, email, phones, and that means that will bring more witch hunting than even probably tiptoeing into people's bedrooms, you know. And the promotion provision directly touches on the work of civil society. So if we say that stays, that means there's not going to be any advocacy, because all of us are going to be closed down. If you stand up to speak for LGBTI people, or even in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of housing, if you stand up to say a gay person, a lesbian person, a trans person is entitled to housing, that is going to be deemed promotion. So in my opinion, none of that bill should stay. We just have to keep working to see that it does not get considered at all.
Good. One or two more questions, I think.
Hi, my name is Francesca. I work at the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security. Just very frankly and openly, could you tell me how competition for donor funding has affected your work between other civil society organizations in your individual countries? And how have you seen donor cooperation improving or getting worse over the past 2 years, even though there have been efforts among the donor community of governments to address overlap in funding? Do you see that going anywhere positively? Are you finding that it's a closed door discussion where you're not having enough engagement with the organization among donors themselves for funding?
Do you want to direct that, or just ask anybody on the panel who wants to answer?
Anybody who wants to answer, because I know it's an issue in every country.
Anybody want to take that one on?
They maybe retire the funds, so I don't know.
For us, let's say in Bahrain, they set a rule now. Nobody can give you any funds before they approve of it to go into your account. And if it goes in your account, who gave you the money? And why are you going to use it? And when they see an organization that's getting some funding, then they'll start freezing their money one way or the other. So, and speaking of human rights defenders and human rights, we don't see that much of funding for human rights. And that's in our case.
Yeah, I think there are a few things that I can share here. One, the story of Indonesia itself. Into my knowledge, I think the donor, they have like sort of like agreement on how to perceive Indonesia. The first 10 years of democratization is to support the CSO sector. But after the 10 years, they support the government itself. That's the way that the common way of thinking among the donor itself, mostly from the government sector. This is create kind of a big question, because sometimes, as I told you before in the early of my presentation, that okay, you might have that kind of agenda as a donor, but in the third years, suddenly there is a changes of the agenda, this kind of global war, for instance. Then it's like distract the agenda itself. My point is, sometimes there is a situation where it's not smooth like that. It's not smooth like that. So, and the donor, they don't want to know about this kind of situation. That is one. Second, from that first point, I would say that these days in Indonesia, the NGO who work for human rights, I think it's not that posh organization anymore. It's not a fancy organization anymore. It's a strong organization. We can drive the issue, but I think we still have we are grappling on how to mobilize people, friends, network, and so on and so forth. The third one that I would like to share also the NGO law. There is in the country where the have a very weak democratizations like Indonesia, I think this is the fashion these days, to have the, we call it in the country mass organization law. But just directly to your point about the donor, I think there will be a chapter on how the organization like my organization, a local organization, every 10,000 US dollar, we have to report to the government. That is one. Second, we just allowed to get the money 50,000 US dollar in a year. So with this third point that I made here, I think this supposed to be become our concern itself, because it is true that the implementation of human rights, it's rely on to the local ground, yeah. But the value itself, it's a universal. So the concern supposed to become from the global movement as well, on how to take a look into this massive growing of the NGO law, which is happening or exists everywhere. I think also in Uganda as well. In Southeast Asia, in Cambodia, the situation is worsening at the moment. In Indonesia, we will have this. The parliament just need to finish 4 or 5 articles anymore. It remains unsolved in the discussion at the moment. So I think it's happening everywhere with this kind of issue.
Yeah, in Uganda, I think I would like to respond to that in comparison. I think the kind of funding that we receive as organizations working to promote human rights for sexual minorities versus the funding that the evangelicals and the churches and the people that are working to actually oppress LGBTI individuals. Most of the organizations that we lead are not legal. Some are. I mean, recently, because of the Civil Society Coalition on Human Rights and Constitutional Law, we have sat and said, how can we legalize these groups? And do we have to change names? Because many names where if you come up and say we're the Gay and Lesbian Alliance, nobody will register you. So you have to find another name. And the Constitution, Articles of Association do not have to say anything about gay rights and all of that. So your mandate legally changes. But most of the people that are working to promote human rights for LGBTI individuals are not registered. They are groups, they are small organizations. And so the funding that comes in is equally small. The pool of funds from which we draw is also small. We have, probably 5 funders that all of us are feeding from. And that is not just Uganda, but also Kenya and probably in the region or on the continent as a whole. And when you look at the kind of funding that is coming into churches to ensure that crusades occur, that this kind of indoctrinate, the hatred is really gets down to the ground. In my country, there are prayers held from morning to morning, 24 hours. There's morning glory, there's evening glory, there's lunch hour, there's all kinds of prayers, but there are prayers around the clock. And this is funded. There are crusades, there are fire explosions, there are all kinds of names given to these convention, meetings that last not 3 days as our workshops do, but they last a week. And they bring people from up country and they feed them by the thousands in stadiums. And then people stand up there, American evangelicals from here, and they preach day in and day out about the morality. Now, if you're going to stand up to try and change that tide and change that climate with a $10,000 budget that is going to enable you hold a one-day workshop, bringing together 15 people or 20 people who don't even have transport to go to 3 other villages, you can almost see the impact that you're going to have is minimal. You just have to keep talking, but that is, I think the comparison is not so much in are we getting funding, but the kind of funding that we're getting in comparison to the work that we have to do and what we're up against is really laughable.
Thank you, Julius. We have to wrap up, so I'm going to ask Oleg for his comment on this question, and then we're done.
Very briefly, over the last several years, a number of foreign donors have pulled out of Russia, either under pressure or claiming that Russia had already developed enough to sustain its own civil society, which is unfortunately very untrue. And so the United States isn't the only one, the only country where you can see this inconsistency. But the good news is that slowly, over time, domestic donors also emerge. Mostly these are individuals who are now beginning to realize that they have a moral obligation to support civil society. And I hope that one day we will be able to exist without external donors, but as of now, it's not the case.
Let me thank everybody on our panel. I'm often asked why I do this work, and my answer always is the people you get to meet. And today I got to meet 5 more heroes. So thank you all very much. Thanks to everybody in the audience.